Okay, welcome everyone to our monthly series, Inside the Acid-Free Box. I'm Jordanna and I'm joined here with Christie, who is in our archive at Holocaust Museum LA. For those of you who are new to this program, every single month, Christie and I delve into a different collection at the museum. We unlock our secure archive and show you some of our collections and artifacts that aren't typically available for visitors, students, and the general public to see and learn from. So this month's Inside the Acid-Free Box is a behind-the-scenes look at the stories of Jewish American liberators. May, as many of you must or might know, is American Jewish Heritage Month, and so we wanted to honor that by taking a look at some stories of Jewish men who fought in the American liberating armies. Christie, do you want to tell some of our new friends who are joining us about our archival collection?
Yeah, so the museum's collection contains about 610 collections and sub-collections within that, with somewhere in the vicinity of 20,000 artifacts and objects and documents. So many of the collections that we have at the museum relate to a particular person or maybe a particular family, such as some of the ones that we're going to look at today, and include materials like photographs, documents, three-dimensional objects, maybe like badges and pins, particularly with the ones we're looking at today. Some of those are related to the military service, and other textiles, family heirlooms, things like that. And then we have a selection of Holocaust survivor and history testimony as well. So the collections that we're going to look at today specifically relate to some of the experiences of Jewish soldiers that served in Europe during World War II as part of the US military.
And here you can see two items from our collection. We actually won't be covering these specific artifacts, but for those of you who visited the museum, know that we have an entire gallery dedicated to the liberation and end of the Holocaust. And here are two artifacts we feature in our gallery space. One is a soldier's helmet that was donated by an American who actually took it and wrote the different places he had fought. And you can see he wrote kaput with an arrow pointing towards the swastika. And then here's another photograph. And this is actually, I think, really a good example of the different types of artifacts we have at the museum donated by the liberators themselves. Many soldiers had their own personal cameras or were part of official photography groups where they would photograph the liberation process. And this is a photograph taken by a soldier. And you can see he wrote on the photograph, boxcars outside of Dachau prison. So this is shortly after the liberation of Dachau in April of 1945 by the American Army. And he writes, all boxcars were filled with the bodies of prisoners who had died. And so this is sort of the what many soldiers and liberators were confronted with. Although most of the American government and high military command knew of the concentration camps, and there were already aerial photos of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the largest of all of the concentration camps. The knowledge of locations of the specific camps in Europe were not always known. I mean, there were over 40,000 ghettos and camps in Europe established by the Nazis and their collaborators. And so oftentimes American, Canadian, British, and Red Army soldiers liberated camps without even being aware of what they were about to stumble upon. And for many of the soldiers, they witnessed piles of dead bodies, emaciated, starving prisoners, and people just in desperate need of medical attention. And it was really, I think, a shocking experience for many of the soldiers. A little bit about American Jewish soldiers during World War II. There were over 500,000 Jewish men and women who served in the US Armed Forces during World War II, and it accounted for 4.23% of the American servicemen. However, Jews only made up less than 4% of the American population, so you actually had a higher percentage of Jews serving than there were a percentage of the American population. The total number of casualties of American Jewish soldiers was just over 38,000. And about 200,000 Jewish soldiers of various Allied armies were taken prisoner or POWs by the Germans. For Western Allied Jewish soldiers, so that's Jewish men serving in the American armies, the Canadian Army, the British Army, or even the French Army, oftentimes it wasn't clear how they would be treated based on their religious identity. So depending on how they were captured and who captured them, they could face extreme or worse conditions than their fellow soldiers, or they could face the same conditions as their fellow POW soldiers. That was not the case in Eastern Europe. So for Polish Jews or Russian Jews or Eastern European Jews who were captured as POWs as part of either the Polish army, the Red Army, or other local collaborating armies, they were mostly murdered or killed on the spot by the Germans. And so there were different experiences and different challenges facing the Jewish soldiers who fought on the Allied forces. Here you can actually see a photograph from a military cemetery in the north of France, right in Normandy. This is one of the D-Day cemeteries, and you can see a Jewish star headstone because there were Jewish soldiers who did land on the beaches of Normandy with the Allied armies. So we're going to touch really quickly on 3 different gentlemen who fought during World War II as part of the American Army, each one of them doing an extraordinary thing and really having a very interesting impact on the liberation and end of World War II. So first, we're going to touch on Burn Stevens. He was behind enemy lines during World War II. He was originally born in Germany in 1920. He and his family enjoyed a very typical, normal life in Germany until the Nazis came to power. And just because of the increasing anti-Semitism, obstacles and challenges facing Burn and his family, they made the ultimate decision to try and leave. His father and one of his brothers were unsuccessful in being admitted into the United States and had to remain behind in Germany, but Burn was able to emigrate to the United States and arrived in 1939. Not shortly after he arrived. So although World War II began on September 1st, 1939, the US did not join the war until December of 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. For many of you who know, Japan and Nazi Germany were actually allied as part of the Axis powers. And so when America declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on the US, and thus the US joins World War II. So Burn attempts to enlist in the US Army as a volunteer. He is at first told no. He's eventually accepted, and after completing basic training, he's recruited by the OSS, which was the precursor for the CIA. He was part of the Jewish Five and was sent to Europe, where he was behind enemy lines on a secret mission in Austria. And he and 4 other men were part of a 5-man team, all of them European Jews, each of them speaking at least 2 different languages. And their mission was to infiltrate the area around Innsbruck, Austria, and monitor the reports of the Nazis stockpiling arms and ammunition there. A secondary mission of theirs was to monitor all of the rail traffic from Innsbruck traveling through into Italy. So it was definitely a very intense secret operation. And so Christie, do you want to tell us a little bit of the images we're looking at? And I know you might have some artifacts to share with us.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, Burn eventually joins the army. Initially, he was rejected because of the fact that he wasn't a US citizen, but eventually he's able to become naturalized and is accepted into the army, and then is quickly picked up after basic training by the OSS. And so we're looking at obviously a picture of him in his military uniform, and you can actually see, and we have this in the collection on display in the 7th gallery that talks about liberation, the paratrooper insignia that's on his hat, and we actually have that patch as part of the collection. So he was trained as a paratrooper, and then he's eventually sent on a mission that was dubbed the Dylan mission, where he is basically dropped behind enemy lines in Austria, and as Jordanna mentioned, to basically gather intel about what the Nazis were doing. So we have actually his fake ID cards as part of the collection. So I will just hold it up here so you can actually see it obviously has his photo and other information about him, but if you can see here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it because it's backwards, but basically he was given a fake identity of Peter Hartley, and it was actually the identity of a real soldier who had died. All the other information on there is actually his correct information, but he was given this fake identity, and the religion on his identification, his dog tags and everything else was changed, because obviously it was, felt that if you were captured and identified as Jewish, there was that heightened risk if you were captured by the enemy. So he was listed as Protestant on the fake identification documents. And so he's dropped behind enemy lines and basically dropped directly into a Gestapo trap and is immediately captured, unfortunately. However, he essentially manages to maintain his cover. He tries to speak halting German, and so that he is essentially not discovered. And then he eventually is actually able to convince his Nazi captors that it's in their best interest, that the tide of the war has turned, and it's in their best interest to surrender to him because he, is an important person he's an American spy, so they can actually surrender to him. And so then they are tasked with basically taking a surrender party across enemy lines. And then he is eventually captured again by another Nazi colonel who doesn't agree with the surrender plan, basically. And we have a clip of him actually talking about that. But I'm sorry, I realized I've skipped ahead. We have a clip of him talking about from the USC Shoah Foundation testimony that he gave in the 90s about him talking about his reasons for basically wanting to join the military and to enlist and go overseas and fight with the US Army.
Yeah, and you can see here also his ID card from Nazi Germany, where there's a big J stamped in his ID. And then, of course, that's until he comes to the United States. But he was a German Jew.
So eventually, that got to somewhere in the army where somebody noticed the qualifications, and just like us, I was pulled out of training. And I was led into a quiet room where there was a captain who said that whatever happens in this room, whatever conversation we have here, is not to be passed on to anyone. And he made that remark before we had any discussion. He said, "You agree to this. No matter what happens in this room, it is not to be passed on." I said, "Fine." And he asked me some questions. And I said, "Why do you ask these questions?" And he said, "We'll get into this later." And he asked questions like, if you were in Germany and you were, first he asked, would I help the army? Would I be willing to go to Germany and do something different than carrying a rifle? I said, I'd love to go. I would like to go. And my father's in the concentration camp as far as I know. And the rest of my family is in concentration camps. And I'd love to go and help freeing them and anybody else, or anything else that I could do, rather than just carrying a rifle. And he said, fine, that's good.
So here you can see it's really, I think, Burns' desire to do something when he knows that his father and his brother, last he heard, are in concentration camps. And so his desire and passion to want to enlist is because of them, because he wants to do something to free them. Ultimately, he does learn after the war that his father and brother perished in the Holocaust.
So eventually, that got to somewhere in the army where somebody noticed the qualification.
Yeah, sorry. So here we can see some photos from his time during and after the war. So Christie, can you tell us a little bit about the photos that we see?
Yeah, so the photo on the left, you can see, is obviously taken in Germany, and he was actually in Salzburg. So the Nazi officials that were surrendering to him was, the negotiation of surrendering that particular area. So I think this was actually taken after, but he did negotiate that surrender. But by the time, he was, like I mentioned, he was captured and then by an SS colonel, and so by the time that they actually managed to evade that situation, the general surrender of Nazi Germany had happened, and so it wasn't really needed that localized surrender was to happen, really. And then the photo on the right is a picture of him after he had returned from Europe to the US. It was actually taken for a newspaper article with a local newspaper, and you can see, the various Nazi paraphernalia in front of him. He's wearing a Nazi hat. And he's holding the jacket of one of the Nazi officers that actually interrogated him while he was imprisoned. And it was taken, after the war, after he'd returned for a newspaper article, just basically talking about his story and his exploits and the fact that he was willing and able to return and fight against the country that had basically rejected him. So. And then we have another clip where he was actually talking about the capture, where he was captured with the rest of the surrender party by the SS colonel from his USC Shoah Foundation testimony as well, where he's talking about, almost being discovered or essentially being discovered as Jewish.
And incarcerated us and asked who I was. I was still in American uniform with a flight jacket. And they said, it's a spy. He said, he's an American spy. This is it. And they took me in a room and interrogated me. And then they said, take your pants off. You might be Jewish for all we know. And I did. And they found out I was circumcised. And he said, aha. And I said, you idiot. Don't you know that everybody in America is circumcised? How dumb can you be? And I just yelled at him at the top of my voice. I said, what are you trying to do? Don't you know any better? And he said, okay, put your pants back on. And that was very close.
Yeah, and I think, just the fact that Bern was a German national, to be living in the US at a time of a war, to elect to join the army, to go undercover in a secret operation, and to think so quickly on his feet after being captured, to kind of spin a story very convincingly about the fact that he wasn't Jewish, really just speaks to his ability to be resilient and really strong in his will, and ultimately saving his own life.
Yeah, it's incredible to me, even just to hear him talk about it. And there's so many different stories and clips of him talking about, near misses and almost, being discovered and being captured. And, the way that he talks about it too, this is like such an incredibly brave man to do what he did, to return to a country that he had essentially had to flee from because he was Jewish, and then to return undercover, to fight against the Nazis and, stand up for what is right and, try and stand up for his father and brother, who at this point, he, really didn't know what had happened to them. But that he can just, talk about it so humbly is just incredible to me.
Yeah, and I just a reminder for everyone, you can drop questions in the Q&A. We will have time at the end to answer, but if you think of one as it's going, feel free to ask it. And before we move on to the next person, I just also wanted to point out this photo on the right. You see the Olympic rings on that flag. And I also think this is such a strong moment, because Bern Stevens could have been an Olympian skier, but was unable to join the German team for the 1936 Olympics because he was Jewish. And so just everything that he overcame because of his identity. So the next, the next liberator we're going to talk about is Barry Ziff. So Barry Ziff was born in the United States. Unlike Bern, he was an American. So he was born in 1919 in Ohio, and he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1941 following World War II, or following the U.S. entering World War II because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There had been several instances before December of 1941 in which the U.S. was close to joining the war, but there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the U.S. Just because of the way in which the Great War ravaged so much of the young American population. World War I, known as the Great War, at that time was the most number of people who had ever died in a war. And there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the US, but of course that did change with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So shortly after that, Barry and many young men across the US are drafted into the US Army. So he's drafted 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and he serves in an anti-aircraft battalion and in 89th Infantry Division during World War II. He actually entered the European theater through the Normandy beaches and was in the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, and also, as we'll talk about in a second, witnessed the liberation of concentration camps. Just a quick note, Battle of the Bulge was a very intense counter attack by the Germans. At this point of the war, after the success of D-Day in June of 1944, Germany is now fighting a two-front war. Most military historians will tell you, or experts will tell you, that it's very difficult to win a two-front war. And with the Red Army in the East and the British, Americans, and Canadians in the West, it was clear to most people that ultimately Germany would lose. However, they were very much against surrendering. The official line coming down from the top of, Berlin, coming down from like the top echelons of German government, was that they should not surrender. And so this was a major counterattack where tens of thousands of young men died, and Barry Ziff survived that. And Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald, was actually the first concentration camp to be liberated by Western allies. The Soviets had already liberated a few different concentration camps as early as late summer 1944 in Eastern Europe, but this is the first camp to be liberated by a Western ally. And Barry Ziff was part of that liberation. He documented his experience in a letter to his parents at the time, and later in oral and written testimony. And it's really, I think, just a remarkable piece of a primary source document. Here's a copy of the letter that we have in our gallery space, and a photo of Barry. And I know that Christie has it with her, so I'm going to stop the share so she can show us. But we actually feature this letter prominently in our 7th gallery at the museum, and invite students and visitors to read the letter and just really listen through reading to Barry's words, because they're so powerful and so articulate in the ways that in which he describes his experience and what he witnessed at liberation.
Yeah, so well, we have the photos, like you mentioned. So the photo was actually taken a little bit before. So the photo was from March of 1944, and according to the back, it's taken in London. So this is a picture of him in his uniform, obviously. And then the letter is actually dated April 9th, 1945. So as I understand it, I think the liberation was around April 4th. So you can see that the letter was written not long after that. And, Barry talks about, it's 2 pages. And like Jordanna mentioned, it's really kind of a unique artifact for us, or, to see in general, because to hear, we often see liberation photography of the camps. And I think Ohrdruf is one of the most well-documented camps in terms of liberation photography as well. A lot of the famous photographs that you see that we'll touch on in a minute are from this camp. But to have this written testimony that happened, right after the fact, like right after he had seen and witnessed these scenes, and to hear him talking about, interacting with the prisoners. He spoke German and he spoke Yiddish. So, he was able to have this unique interaction with these prisoners, and speak to them in a language that they understood, obviously. And then they were able to tell him about their experiences and what they'd been through, and direct, the soldiers to other areas of the camp, other areas that were nearby, where, the Nazis, in their haste to leave, had, shot and burned prisoners and other things, and attempt to kind of cover up what had been done.
Yeah, and I think in this letter, he mentions to his parents, like, perhaps you can have this letter printed in a newspaper. It's just so remarkable to consider. I mean, he's a young man, barely not a child anymore. And he is part of this liberating force that liberates a concentration camp where there are piles of dead bodies, half burned in the woods, barely living survivors. And he's all of a sudden put in the place as being a translator immediately for them, to explain to them what's happening, to explain to his fellow soldiers, what they're telling him. And for him to write this very detailed report to his parents, to both his mother and his father, I think is unique at that time. Christie was saying earlier to me that there are many different instances in which soldiers did not write such horrific details if they know that a woman was going to read the letter at home. And I think really Barry is bearing witness to what he sees and understands its criticalness in learning about the atrocities that he's just faced and seen. And for him to even say to his parents, like, perhaps you can have this letter printed because people should know. Now today it might seem obvious that somebody would want the world to know, but at that time, our understanding of trauma or traumatic events was very different from what it is now. And for him to just have that clarity and understanding that the world needed to hear this, I think is quite remarkable.
So this is just one of those, images from the liberation of the camp that I mentioned before. And in this photo, so Barry actually has testimony with the Shoah Foundation as well that was taken in the 90s. And he actually talks obviously about the letter and about the liberation of the camp. But he also talks about, the significance of and understanding the significance of what he was witnessing, because at that time, like Jordanna mentioned earlier, there really, there was an understanding that there was camps and there was concentration camps, but the full extent of what was happening and the atrocities that were being committed by the Nazis was really not known. And so, it was recognized that it was important to document and really bear witness to what had happened. And so the picture that we're looking at here is actually a picture of the camp and the liberation scenes, but in the middle, it might be a little bit hard to see, but in the middle of the picture is actually Eisenhower. And so he visited the camp because, he was contacted by General Patton, and they were, basically told, you need to see what is happening here. And he's actually there. And Barry talks about this photo and being, in the background. He's not actually in the photo, but being in the background and witnessing, these higher echelons of the military coming to also bear witness to what they were seeing.
How were you impacted as a Jew and as an American by what you've seen in the camps?
Well, naturally, it affected me far more than the soldiers who were not Jewish, because while not all of the inmates were Jewish, a good portion of them were Jewish, so I had a very strong feeling for them. And I still have a very strong feeling for the survivors, because I know what they went through. I know what the camps were like. It made a very vivid impression on me.
So that's just him, talking about the experience of being Jewish and being put into this situation of liberating the camps. And, obviously it's something that really stuck with him and had a profound impact on his life, because we know from other parts of the testimony, but also from his family, who we were actually recently able to reconnect with, that he became very much more involved with memorialization of the Holocaust and other Holocaust causes later in life, and would, participate and speak about his experiences as a liberator and, as a Jewish soldier later in his life.
How were you?
And also, I think, Christie, you mentioned that Barry was a writer later in life.
Yeah, so he was, I guess, a prolific writer, because, we have his letter. We also have another testimony that he wrote around about the same time that kind of gives a broader scope of his experiences during the war. And then, after he returns home, apparently his family had mentioned that he actually had a letter published in Life magazine, and he worked for a time as a comedy and TV writer when he came back after the war. And so, he has this passion for writing, I guess, and we really see that in the way that he crafted this the letter.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unbelievable to even consider how it affected him, and the way in which you can see he gets very emotional during that interview where he is talking about it affecting him, and he says it might have affected him more than it did, the other soldiers, because he was of the Jewish faith and understood that this was, a genocide targeted against people that he shared an identity with. And really, I think, our understanding of the liberation of the camps, I just want to read a piece of his letter. In the second paragraph, he writes, "It's rather hard to describe something like that because you really have to see it to believe it. I know that I'll never forget it. It was a large camp, and someone said it contained 15,000. And he goes on to just describe the sense in which he couldn't believe the horrors that he was witnessing. He couldn't believe the capacity that people had to do such horrific things to one another. He talks about how the people who he liberated, who had survived, that they were nothing but skin-covered bones and their thighs were no thicker than their ankles. He writes that their hip bones stuck out 4 inches from either side of their stomachs, and none could have weighed more than 60 pounds. They didn't take up much room than a sack of a dozen potatoes we have. And he goes on to just describe a gruesome scene. And I think to have a testimony like this is really crucial in our understanding, both from the military perspective, but also from the survivor perspective of what liberation meant for them, and what that sort of "you're free" experience was. And it wasn't necessarily as wonderful as we would think the word free would mean. And he goes on to really, really capture that testimony.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you mentioned the impact of the soldiers and of liberation on them. And, you hear about how, like, a lot of Holocaust survivors, particularly right after and even up to more recently, really didn't talk about their experiences. And if there's one thing that's definitely been a common thread throughout, this experience and doing research for this talk, is that, the soldiers didn't talk about their experience either. It was too horrific and, almost too much to even be able to process. They really didn't talk about it. And, the families of some of the collections that we're looking at today mentioned that their father or grandfather, they really didn't talk about their experience. And it's definitely something that I hear a lot. And so, it's really that just had an impact on them that probably is really beyond, words.
Yeah. And, just us talking right now in this conversation, I know that this is an artifact that's in the museum, but sometimes we need a program like today to really sit and consider the thought process. And, I've read this letter many, many times, and I'm just only noticing now that towards the end of it, he says that he believes that the Germans seem to be in their death thrones, but I suppose that the Nazi leaders are prepared to fight to the last man. And now in the same conversation where I talked about that he was at the Battle of the Bulge and saw it with his own experience, the fact that the Germans were ready to fight till the bitter end, even though it was obvious to everyone that they were going to lose, for him to even just acknowledge it in his letter and then say, they're ready to go to any lengths. I hope the Russians beat us to Berlin. And I think that really shows us maybe how terrified he was for his own life, that this war was just going to continue, despite the fact that the concentration camps are already being liberated, and despite the fact that, the Allies are already in Germany, winning the war. So I just, this was the first time that I thought about that in that context.
Yeah, and it's such, like you mentioned, it's such an important part of our collection. It's, it's on display in our 7th gallery where we talk about liberation, but also this is something that he donated back in like the 90s. So, it's been in the museum's collection. It predates the building that we're in, but it is still something that we display and that we use as such an important artifact to explore this kind of the history.
So we spoke about somebody who was an undercover operative. We talked about somebody who was part of the liberation efforts. And now we are going to talk about Joseph Rappaport, who was part of also the identifying and interrogating of Nazis following the end of the war. So Joseph was originally born in Vienna in 1922. So similar to Byrne, was born in Europe and fled because of Nazis' rise to power. So he and his siblings are able to escape Austria in 1938, which is the same year that Nazi Germany took over Austria and annexed it into its country. He was drafted into the army in 1942. He trained as a medic, as well as with the Army's specialized training program for languages. He was then sent to Europe with the counterintelligence, where he worked as an interrogator for 7 months. And again, just like similar to Byrne, his skill of being a native and having this native language was seen as a plus, and is seen as a skill that was definitely needed. So as Byrne went in undercover, Joseph was used as help to interrogate Nazi officials. And he also served as a military guard during the Nuremberg Trials.
Yes.
And I know, Christie, you have a number of different artifacts of his, so I'll stop the share.
Yeah, so this collection, actually, so Joseph is the father of one of the museum's docents, Judith. And so again, speaking with the families for some of the individuals for these collections has been great and so helpful. So this is another collection that's been with the museum since I think the 90s. And so it's quite an extensive collection. I believe it started out as an album, and it was an album that Joseph had put in various photographs that he'd taken of his experiences while he was, in training here in the US, while he was overseas, different military insignia, different photographs, different newspaper articles and things like that. So as Jordan mentioned, we definitely have an extensive collection that kind of spans the scope of his experience. So he was in the Army Specialized Training Program, so the ASTP for languages, and he was part of the languages team. And so that was basically a group that was established via the military to be able to train these soldiers in different languages and things and skills that would be helpful to them when they were sent overseas. So we have the insignia patch for his ASTP. So I actually had to look it up, but it basically is a lamp, which is supposed to be symbolic of the lamp of knowledge, which is a suggestion towards the academic learning that they were receiving, overlaid with a sword, which obviously represents the military. And so, he studies there for a time, he graduates from that program, and then he's sent for another 5 months to study Russian, but then ultimately he goes back to his original unit, and he is basically trained as a medic as part of that original unit. So we have some of the photographs, and I think this is the larger picture of one that we were just looking at. So this is from 1944, so you can obviously see this is actually when he was doing training at Fort McCoy, but you can see he had the medic patch on his arm there.
Lift the photo up just a little bit. Perfect.
And then we also have some other photos. So I thought this was interesting because on first glance I was like, oh, what is this picture? But it's actually another picture from, it's kind of a big one, but it's from Fort McCoy as well. And you can see they're doing like training drills. This one actually is a one in a series, and it's like a photo of them doing training with gas masks and training to be able to deal with chemical warfare and things like that. So that's some of the pictures from him while he was still in the US, while he was training essentially. So then we see he's eventually sent to Europe via London for a time, and then he arrives and he's stationed in Nuremberg in June 1945, and he was part of the counterintelligence corps. And so some of the photos that we're actually looking at here are from his actual time at that facility. And so it was essentially Stalag 13, it was called, and it was essentially a prisoner of war camp that had been established by the Nazis that held prisoners of war from many of the countries that Germany had invaded at that time. And then it was essentially taken over by the Americans and turned into a prisoner of war camp for Nazi officials. And so what we're looking at here, thanks to the family, we don't actually have these photos in the collection yet, so I only have the digitals right now. But we're looking at some photos of Joseph in action. So the photo on the right there is a picture of him actually doing intake with a German soldier. And so down the bottom, you can see he's actually, he was very much into writing captions on the back of his letters, which is fantastic for us because he's no longer with us. So we know the dates and the descriptions of, what was happening in some of these photos. So it makes it much easier for me in my job to be able to catalog these things and kind of put together a timeline. But yeah, you can see, the look on the soldier's face, and from the caption, we understand that basically Joseph was, looking through this particular soldier's record and saying it's not too clean. And you can see by the look on his face that he kind of understood that as well. And then the picture on the left is actually a picture of, we're still trying to work out who the individuals are. And Judith and I have been back and forth this week trying to work out the particular people and if we can potentially match them to any particular Nazis, because the caption on the back basically just says Nazi SS generals. And so, but yeah, it's just a picture of them, while they're imprisoned at Stalag 13, just kind of hanging out, having a chat. There's other pictures within the collection where they're lining up to get food. So, he's like snapping these photos, incredible photos of, Nazi SS generals and other Nazi officials just doing these everyday things while he was posted in that interrogation position.
Yeah, and actually, so Stalag 13 had been a POW camp used by the Nazis, and General Patton's son-in-law was imprisoned there as well. And so following the liberation, I think there was, for American soldiers to be liberating American POWs and then using the same space as a POW camp for German military men and also SS is really interesting to think about. The Americans actually renamed it Camp Denny Clark, which was named after a medic. So similar to Joseph Rappaport, who was a medic, was named after a medic who had been killed in action. And they used it to intern former Nazi party members and also, interrogate them, which is just unbelievable to think about. Here's this Austrian Jewish man who had to flee his homeland, now returning as a member of the American army, interrogating Nazi officials. And I know, Christie, you mentioned that he had a certain charming personality where he would just draw information from people.
Yeah, from speaking to the family, apparently he was quite a charismatic guy, a people person. So he often would be able to kind of go into the local towns in plain clothes and, chat to the townspeople and try and get a handle on people that they were looking for. And there's a story that the family also told me that, he might have been involved in interrogations with some higher up Nazis, possibly Klaus Barbie. We're not sure. We don't know if we can confirm that or not. But, he also tells the story of, or he told the story of while he was serving as a prisoner escort in the Nuremberg Trials, playing chess with Goring. So, do we he was this charming guy and really a personable person. So, you have to wonder, did they know that he was Jewish? Did that come up at all? How does that kind of gel?
Yeah, and just his tactics of withdrawing information through being a very charismatic person. And I mean, at the end of the war, SS officers and Nazi officials were trying to escape being captured, and even as going so far as some Nazi or SS officials had their blood type tattooed on their inner arm. And they went as far as sometimes cutting out that skin because they didn't want to be captured or identified. And so even just the process of trying to, and there are countless accounts of, camp guards putting on prisoner uniforms at liberation. And, to think that here's this man who's trying to interrogate and get information from the local populations, from the people around him, over who's really a Nazi. And then, I mean, to be photographed at the Nuremberg trial, standing with men held responsible and found guilty of crimes against humanity. The first time that this term is used in a courtroom, our first time having an international military tribunal set up with the purpose of holding people responsible for crimes against humanity. And Christie, why don't you tell us a little bit about this photo?
Yeah, so this one we actually have courtesy of the Holocaust Museum in DC. So we have a copy of this actually on display in the 7th gallery in the particular area where we talk about the Nuremberg trials. And so we know from the family, we understand that Joseph actually, as I mentioned, served as a prisoner escort in the Nuremberg trials. And so he can be seen, we've been told from the family, the third guard from the left at the back. So you can see the military guard are the soldiers standing at the back with the white helmets. And then we're looking at just, all of the Nazis that were being tried at the Nuremberg trials.
And I know you have some artifacts to show us.
Yeah. So we have we also have the tickets from Joseph, and you can actually see. So it says, it's backwards again.
No, it's I can see it the right way. Don't worry.
It's just me that's looking at it backwards. So it's basically a ticket to the visitors gallery of the trial. So obviously the guards, would swap out and be subbed in by other guards to take their place, so they weren't, on duty for the entire time. So, Joseph obviously had the opportunity to actually go and witness the trials from the visitors gallery as well. So we have the ticket stub from that as part of the collection.
Yeah, and just a reminder, the Nuremberg Trials took place shortly after the war in 1946 in a justice palace, a courthouse in Nuremberg, Germany, which was chosen in part because it hadn't been bombed out, but also because of Nuremberg being a very important place to the Nazis themselves. And it was a series of military tribunals held by the Allied forces, including the French, the British, the Russians, and the Americans. And so actually the trials were done in 4 different languages: German, French, English, and Russian. And it's a really, I think, important moment in international law and in our understanding of how people can be held responsible. And, when we use the word genocide and we talk about how the word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who believed that if a person should be held responsible for murdering another person, so should a community be held responsible for murdering another community. And this is what the Nuremberg trials were. So for him to even witness that, both as an official capacity, but even as just somebody watching the trials, I think it's really a remarkable historical moment to be a part of. Oh, here's the photo again. And I mean, these are some very well-known, notorious, infamous men that are in this photo, and to stand so close to them. So you can actually see Göring is right here, who was a very high Nazi official.
Yeah, and actually I just noticed in the chat that Judith commented and said, yes, the Nazi prisoners did know that Joseph was Jewish, but they didn't comment. So there you go.
And so now we'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you everyone so much for joining us on just like a look at 3 remarkable, just a touch on 3 remarkable individuals who served in the American military or American forces and took part in liberating concentration camps, ending the war, and in the interrogation of Nazi officials. I think that these 3 men represent a much larger community of heroism, strength, resiliency, and just such an important part of history and an acknowledgement. If not for the Liberators, if not for the men who were drafted and the men who signed up to join to fight, who knows how the war would have turned out, or when Nazi Germany would have finally been beaten, and those, survivors who were on sort of towards the end of their lives, given an opportunity to live and to live freely. So it's all thanks to these 3 men and others. So you can put your questions in the Q&A. I see that there is a question about, are there books that can explore their stories in further depth that you'd recommend to learn more? I'm not sure how many stories or books there are about these 3 gentlemen. There is a little bit of information out there related to Burns Stevens on the Jewish 5. And I know, Christie, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other resources people might have related specifically to this topic?
Yeah, so there's definitely Shoah testimony. And, we touched on it a little bit today. So it's Burns and Barry both have Shoah testimony. They are, I believe, at least with Barry, I can't remember with Burn, but they might be ones that actually have to visit the museum to access. But hopefully when we reopen, that will be a possibility, because they're those ones that are only accessible from the museum as like one of those points that you can actually access the testimony. But there's other information out there, and one of the children of the people we talked about today is a docent at the museum, so you can always get in touch with her. Because I think the question came from somebody that's a staff member, so you can always get in touch with her when we reopen as well. I'm sure she would love to chat more about the history of Joseph.
I do believe there's the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. There are, I think, historical and research papers published about, letters from Jewish youth at war, letters from American soldiers. There's also a very large comprehensive book called A World at Arms, History of World War II, which looks at the global history of the war and has chapters on each aspect of it, everything ranging from the Pacific theater to the European theater, to the Holocaust, to the liberating armies. If you ever find yourself in Normandy in France, there are a few different museums dedicated to the liberating forces, which also touch upon the Jewish soldiers who fought there and died there. As you saw in the first photo, there's actually cemeteries that you can visit. So there is some information where you can learn more about this very, I think, unique piece of history. Is the Barry Ziff in the picture with Eisenhower at Ohrdruf? So Barry Ziff is not in that photograph that we showed, but it's Eisenhower at Ohrdruf, and Barry Ziff was in the foreground of the photograph. So he wasn't in the photograph, but he witnessed the photograph being taken. He just wasn't pictured in it. And yes, it was at Ohrdruf. So not only did he liberate Ohrdruf, which was a sub-camp of Buchenwald, as we talked about, but he was there for several days witnessing Eisenhower and Patton coming to the concentration camp to bear witness. And actually that was something that was really important to Eisenhower. We saw a quote of his earlier where he said he never wanted there to be a moment where this was called propaganda. And later when he was president of the United States, he actually had photographs of the liberation in the White House in his office as serving as a reminder to himself and to others that this had taken place. And so, and Ohrdruf being the first concentration camp to be liberated by the Western Allied armies really was this moment in which Eisenhower, Patton, and the public became very much aware of what had transpired in these places.
Yeah, and we see a lot of, photography of the liberation of the camps, and it's definitely something that gets donated a lot because it's seemingly, like you said, it comes from Eisenhower and had that trickle down effect that it was important for him to document what had actually happened. And so there were photographs taken by various units within the military that were then widely distributed to soldiers. So there is a lot of that photography about today.
And I saw also a photograph about the Barry Ziff letter. So currently you can't access it digitally. If you want to shoot us an email, we can send you a digital copy. One of Christie's many jobs is overseeing our digital archive, which she is currently overseeing the transfer of tens of thousands of digital artifacts to a new platform where you will be able from anywhere in the world to explore our artifact collection. So when that is complete, you will be able to see the Barry Ziff letter as well as other artifacts in our collection from the comfort of your own home. You can always, of course, we are opening our museum July 1, so you can come and visit and see the letter in person in our gallery space, along with many different artifacts we have donated by American soldiers and liberators and their families.
Yeah, and I just want to also say thank you to all of the families for all of the additional information. So as great as it is to obviously have these incredible artifacts and materials from these soldiers, it is also very helpful to have background information about the person. And, talking to the families over the last couple of weeks, the Bernd Stevens collection, I've said it before, is one of my favorite collections. So I've had the opportunity since we did the talk, the very first Inside the Acid Free Box talk about him back in to speak with one of his daughters. And that was great to kind of get some more background information about him. And then just more recently, Barry Ziff's children and granddaughter, and then obviously Judith and her brother David as well about the Joseph Rappaport collection. So thank you so much. It's one of the favorite my job is to be able to bring these stories to life more with not only the artifacts, but also the stories and information from the families that knew these people.
And Christie, what is an acid-free box?
It's basically a reference to the materials that we use to actually house the artifacts. So the boxes, the special archival boxes that we use are acid-free, and it all relates to basically the preservation of the artifacts and making sure that we're giving them as long a life as possible.
Thank you all for joining us for this really interesting conversation, and I think important one to honor not just American Jewish Heritage Month, but to honor the individuals who gave their lives or served during World War II in order to, liberate and free the survivors, as well as, countless other individuals who were persecuted by the Nazis and their collaborators. If you are interested in joining another one of our programs and you're interested in this topic or related topics, there are two I just want to quickly highlight for you. So if you're interested also in exploring more on Jewish American Heritage Month, On May 26th, which is next Wednesday at 11 a.m., we're partnering with UCLA to talk about mapping Jewish history and exploration of a Jewish neighborhood here in Los Angeles. We will be exploring Boyle Heights, a multi-ethnic, diverse community, which was home to the largest Jewish community west of Chicago at one point. I think will be a really interesting conversation for all of you out there who love Jewish history or love Los Angeles history, or just interested in sort of learning more about the community. Also, Christie mentioned earlier how there was actually the US Signal Corps, which was responsible with documenting the evidence of the Nazi war crimes, documenting the evidence of the concentration camps, and distributing it. So on June 9th at 11 a.m., we're actually going to be having a conversation with an artist named Jack Boole, and he was stationed at a POW camp as part of the US Army. He was stationed in Italy, and he saw a lot of these photographs of the atrocities at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. So Buchenwald, including Ohrdruf, which we talked about today. And he was so impacted, or it was such an impact on him as a Jewish man, but also as somebody guarding or stationed at a POW camp. He painted a series of pieces just to express his emotions, express the feelings of being, shown these images of the concentration camps and wanting to document the Holocaust in his own way. So we invite you to join us for that. It's June 9th at 11 a.m. And then, of course, if you want to talk a little bit more about the liberation of the camps from the side of the survivors, next Thursday, so May 27th at 11 a.m., we will be having a survivor talk with a survivor named Ava Bretler, who was liberated by the British Army at Bergen-Belsen as a young girl, surviving the concentration camps. And she talks a little bit about her experience being liberated and what it felt to see the soldiers approaching. You can always learn more about these programs and the other programs that we put on at our website, hmla.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Christie, for sharing these remarkable primary source artifacts that you care for in our collection. And hopefully we see you guys all very soon at another one of our programs.